We're talking about the Feast of Tabernacles, one of the great feasts of the Bible. We've been in a series that we've been calling the Songs of Ascents. It's a collection of poems, psalms from the book of Psalms that all start the same way. They start Shir Hama'alot. That's on the test later, so make sure you memorize that. It means song of the going up, or probably better, the song of the steps. Because we know the reason they were collected together is for their use in the temple worship. They were all sung together at the Feast of Tabernacles. This giant tome of a book is called the Mishnah. It's rabbinic literature that collects Jewish law from the time of Jesus. And it includes in it a description of the ceremony that they did every year at the Feast of Tabernacles. Kurt read this for you the first week, but I want you today to pretend like you're there. Okay, we're going to reproduce the Feast of Tabernacles together. So pretend like you're in a big court, big stone court, before a bunch of steps in the temple, in the shadow of the temple. Okay? And here's the way it reads out of the Mishnah. It says, at the end of the festival day of the first festival day of the festival, the priests and Levites went down to the women's courtyard, and they made a major enactment by putting the men below and the women above. And there were golden candle holders there, with 4 gold bowls at their top, and 4 ladders for each candlestick, and 4 young priests with jars of oil containing 120 logs would climb up the ladders and pour oil into each bowl. Okay, not quite the same thing. It's not gold, and, well, 120 logs is about 10 gallons. So their lamps were this size. Yeah, right? So, well, so going on, it says, and of the worn-out garments and girdles of the priests, they made wicks, and with them they lit the candlesticks. And there was not a courtyard in Jerusalem which was not lit up by the light of the Beit HaShoshobah. All right, well, let's see here. Not quite the same thing again. Aha. Well, that barely lights the stage, but imagine giant fires, flames, lighting up the entire area that we're in, okay? You can smell the smoke and see it. It continues, it says, and then the pious men and wonder workers would dance before them with flaming torches in their hand, and they sing before them songs and praises, and the Levites, beyond counting, played on harps, lyres, cymbals, trumpets, and other musical instruments. You've all seen, people juggle fire before, I assume. I noticed Sarah moved out of the front row. She watched me practice my juggling, and, well, I'm not 20 anymore, so I'm not going to do that for you. But you've seen that on TV or something, right? That's what's going on. All right, so you got giant fiery torches and men juggling fire and music. And then starts the singing. It says, standing as they played on the 15 steps, which go down from the Israelites' court to the women's court, corresponding to the 15 songs of ascents, which are in the book of Psalms. And on these, the Levites stand with their instruments and sing their song. Yeah, I'm a worse singer than I am a juggler, so I'm not going to make you live through that. But I did find online somebody who sings this song for today, which is Psalm 132. And so you can listen to them and try and pay attention to the words. You could do it. Aha.
Remember, Lord, for David's sake, his afflictions every one. He swore unto the Lord, he vowed to Jacob's mighty one. I will not go into my eyes have sleep or give my eyelids rest till I find a place for the Lord, find a dwelling place for Jacob's mighty one. Look, we heard it there in Ephrathah, found it there in Jair's fields. Let us go up to his dwelling place, let us bow before his feet. Arise, Lord, to your resting place, with the ark your might, and let your priests wear righteousness, your people sing for joy. For the sake of David, your servant, don't turn back the face of your anointed one. He will not turn. One from the womb, who is your fruit, I will set upon your throne. If your sons keep my covenant, my law I'll teach to them, then even their sons evermore upon your throne will sit. Chosen Zion, he desires to have her for his dwelling place. Forever this will be my rest, here I'll dwell as I desire. I'll bless her food abundantly, satisfy her poor with bread. Salvation I will give her priests to cover them like clothes, and then her saints will sing for joy, and David's power will grow. Foes with shame, but on him his crown will shine.
All right. Aren't you glad I didn't sing that? Okay, so we've had our festival together, right, in the temple courts, and lit the flames, and we've sung, and why? Why was it that every year they gathered together and they performed this big ceremony together? What were they trying to accomplish? Well, it all goes back to the wilderness and a man by the name of Moses. Remember the story? So this guy by the name of Israel has 12 sons. Because of famine, they end up moving to Egypt. And they have sons, and their sons have sons, and they become numerous and powerful. And the Egyptians are afraid of them, so they subjugate them. They become slaves in that land. They cry out to God for help, and God raises up for them a deliverer by the name of Moses. Right? He finds Moses in the wilderness, and he tells him, I will be with you, and you will bring the people up, and you'll worship them here on this mountain. So Moses indeed goes to Egypt, and through him, God performs these remarkable miracles we call the 10 plagues, and the people are finally allowed to leave. God has brought them up out of slavery, and he brings them up to the mountain where he met with Moses. And there they sign a covenant, a contract, if you will, with God. God promises them, if you give me your sole allegiance, I will protect you and keep you and bless you. But if you turn your allegiance to someone else, then I'm going to treat you like an enemy. I'm going to curse you, bring your enemies against you, eventually kick you out of the land. Right? So Moses goes up the mountain to get the specific contract, if you will, from God. And even while he's up there, the people are down below already breaking it. And so he tells Moses, well, Mo, you can go up to the land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go with you, because you are a stiff-necked people, and I might destroy you on the way. See, have a holy God dwelling in the midst of a rebellious people is a problem, right? He's afraid he's going to destroy this people before they ever even get to the land because they're rebellious against him. And so he offers, I'll send an angel before you, you take them up, but I'm not going to go with you. Well, Moses pleads with him, and he says, and Moses said to him, if your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me or with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? So God again relents, says, okay, I will go with you, and they did build this tabernacle, this temporary dwelling, for it to hold the covenant and to act as the demonstration of God's presence in their midst. And at the end of the book, God moves in. It says, then a cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So here you have God dwelling in the midst of the people. What do you think is going to happen? Well, of course, they all march up like they're going into the promised land. And they get right up to the border, and Moses sends ahead of them 12 spies to figure out how they're going to go in and take this land. And the spies come back and they said, well, it is a good land, but it's full of strong, powerful people living in walled cities. And the majority of them said, we can't take it. And so the people turned around and started marching back towards Egypt. They rebelled against God. And what does God do? He wipes them out. He says, the Lord replied, Moses begs for their forgiveness, and God says, okay, I have forgiven them, as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me these 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. So, all this promise, God has brought them up out of the land, and they all die there. He makes them wander around in the wilderness for 40 years, living in temporary booths, tabernacles, until they all die. And then he offers the next generation the possibility to enter the land. Well, he gives them a feast to remember this. He tells Moses, have them live in temporary shelters for 7 days, all the native-born Israelites to live in such shelters, so your descendants will know that I had the Israelites live in these temporary shelters when I brought them up from the land of Egypt, for I am Yahweh your God. So that's what this Feast of Tabernacles is all about. It's to remind them of their failure and the tremendous, horrifying consequences that come about of it. Yay! Didn't you enjoy our feast? We can look back and say we were rebellious, and God wiped us out. What a wonderful thing to do every year. Well, because of what we're studying today, the entire meaning of this feast changes. It goes from looking backwards at our failure to looking forwards to a time when we will never again have to wander in the wilderness, living in booths under God's judgment. So what is it that we're looking at today, right? Well, if we look forward in the book of Zechariah, it talks about this future Feast of Tabernacles. It says, then all the survivors from the nations that have attacked Jerusalem will go up year after year to worship the King, Yahweh Almighty, and to celebrate the Festival of Tabernacles. Right? So every nation of the earth is going to come to Jerusalem to worship their divine King. Well, here's how the psalm begins. The psalm is basically made up of two different oaths, two promises. One promise that David makes to God, and then another one that God turns around and makes to David in response. Okay? So here's the promise that David makes. The psalmist says, Lord, remember David in all his self-denial. He swore an oath to Yahweh. He made a vow to the Mighty One of Jacob. I will not enter my house or go to my bed. I will allow no sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids till I find a place for Yahweh, a dwelling for the Mighty One of Jacob. We heard it in Ephrathah. We came upon it in the fields of Jaar. Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool, saying, Arise, Yahweh, and come to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. Make your priests be clothed with your righteousness. May your faithful people sing for joy for the sake of your servant David. Do not reject your anointed one. Okay, so this is a psalm. It's poetry. The goal of the psalmist is basically to remind them of an event they already knew about. An event that's captured in the narrative works of the Bible, but to get them involved. Right? Notice the plurals here. We heard it in Ephrathah. We came upon it in the fields of Jaar. Let us go to the dwelling place. Right? So he's trying to include you. Remember, you're part of this thing that happened in the past, the part of David's promise. Right? So what is that story? I can't remind you of something you may not know, so I'm going to go back and remind you and tell you the story a little bit. All right. So after the people were finally allowed to enter the land, they were led there for a couple hundred years by a series of judges. Every time the people would screw up, they'd cry out to God, and God would send them a judge to deliver them from this new enemy. Right? Kind of like Moses, how he brought up Moses. Well, this gets tiring after a while. Repeated over and over and over again. We fail, and we have to cry out to God, and he finally sends us to deliver. Right, so at the end of this, they're being attacked again by the people called the Philistines, and a couple of corrupt priests decide to bring out God. They bring up the Ark of the Covenant and march it before their army like a weapon. We're going to make God fight our war for us. And it doesn't work. Instead, the Philistines capture the Ark and bring it back and put it in the temple of their God. And they have to learn the hard way that having a holy God in the presence of an unholy people is bad. Right? So they suffer a whole bunch of plagues, similar to the plagues in Egypt, until they finally put the ark back in a cart with a couple of oxen, a whole bunch of gifts, and send it walking, hoping that it'll take the plagues with it. And it goes back into Israel, and it stops in a field where the people let it sit because they're afraid of it now. Well, they demand from God a king. We want somebody who's going to fight our battles for us. So God says, okay, well, I'll give you what you want. And he raises up a man by the name of Saul, who's the biggest, strongest guy in the town. And they make him king. He's going to fight our battles for us. Well, Saul turns out not such a good king. He takes upon himself a role that wasn't given to him. He disobeys God, and so God takes the kingdom away from him, and he gives it to a little shepherd boy by the name of David. What's the difference between King Saul and King David? Well, David knows who the real king is. Right? He depends upon the Lord to fight his battles. And so he comes marching in one day when they're fighting. There's this Goliath giant coming out to meet him. And Saul, the guy who's supposed to go up and fight the battle for them, is sitting in the background fighting, cowering, when David goes, Who is this guy? And David ends up killing this giant in the power of the Lord. All right? So, David rises, Saul falls over time. David becomes a mighty warrior in Saul's kingdom. He marries Saul's daughter, becomes his son-in-law. Finally, when Saul and his presumed heir, Jonathan, die in battle against the Philistines, the people in the south, the tribe of Judah, decide to make David their king. But everybody else chooses a younger son of Saul. And that doesn't work out either. Eventually, they assassinate their own king and make David king of the entire place. So here's David. Now got a people who don't really like him. Right? And he decides to try and create unity in the nation by conquering a city that's kind of on the border between the south and the north, city of Jerusalem, and making it now his new capital. He defeats the Philistines, he's got a new capital, now this is the context for our story today. Okay? So what was the psalmist talking about? He's talking about David bringing the ark up into the city of Jerusalem. So let's go read it in the narrative. It says, after David had constructed buildings for himself in the city of David, he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. And he said to them, you are the heads of the Levitical families. You and your fellow Levites are to consecrate yourselves and bring up the ark of Yahweh, the God of Israel, to the place I prepared for it. All right, so David wants the presence of the Lord to be in the midst of the people, same way Moses did back in the wilderness. And he's prepared a place for it, and he sends people out to get the ark. And then again, they have to learn the lesson that a holy God amongst the rebellious people is a problem. And the guy bringing the ark up tries to touch it, and he dies. So they very carefully research how to do it, and they end up successfully bringing the ark into the city. And it continues. And it says, and David was settled in his palace, and he said to Nathan the prophet, here I am now living in a house of cedar, while the ark of the covenant of Yahweh is under a tent. And Nathan replied to David, whatever you have in mind, do it, for God is with you. All right? I am now settled in place, in a permanent dwelling place in this city. God's still living in a tent. He could pick up and leave just as easily as we brought him here. All right? So he wants to build God a permanent house. Well, God replies. Says, but that night, the word of God came to Nathan saying, go tell my servant David, this is what Yahweh says, you are not the one to build me a house to dwell in. I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought Israel up out of Egypt to this day. I have moved from one tent site to another, from one dwelling place to another. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their leaders, whom I commanded to shepherd my people, why have you not built me a house of cedar? So God says, no, I'm not ready for a permanent dwelling place here. You're not the one to do it. Somebody else is going to do that job. But he continues, and he says, and I will provide a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did in the beginning, and I have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also subdue all your enemies. So he does promise a time when all Israel will be settled, never to be disturbed again, never to be surrounded by enemies. Continues and says, now then tell my servant David, this is what Yahweh Almighty says, I took you from the pasture, from tending flocks, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies before you. Now I look, I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men of the earth. So it's not David who's trying to exalt God. It's God who has always exalted David. All right, this is the job God does. So he tells them, I declare to you that Yahweh will build a house for you. It's not you are building a house for me, it's I'm building a house for you. When your days are over and you go to be with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. I will never take my love away from him as I took it away from your predecessor. I will set him over my house and my kingdom forever. His throne will be established forever. So God is going to set up a kingdom where they will never again be disturbed, where they'll never again be threatened to be taken away and live in booths. And it's going to be by a descendant of David. A kingdom forever. This is huge. It changes everything, right? Well, David has a son by the name of Solomon. Solomon builds a temple. David has planned for it his whole life. He's gathered all the products and things needed to build the temple. He's designed it. He's taught his son how to build it. Solomon goes up and he does it. He builds this tabernacle. He ends up quoting this psalm as part of the dedication ceremony for the temple. And when he's done, God moves in, just like he did to the tabernacle in the wilderness. It says, when Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of Yahweh filled the temple. The priests could not enter the temple of Yahweh because the glory of Yahweh filled it. Fulfilled, right? God is now dwelling in the midst of the people in a permanent dwelling place. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. The author of this book makes it very clear that this was not the right one. Though Solomon built a temple, it wasn't going to be the temple. The author goes through every king in the history of Israel and Judah and shows how every one of them fails. Solomon, wisest man who ever lives. But his heart is turned away by his wives to worship other gods, and God rips away from him most of the kingdom. He gets one tribe, Judah. All the others leave and form their own kingdom, Israel. Now you have civil war again. One by one, every king of Israel, they lift him up and say, maybe this one. But they fail. Maybe this one, but they fail. One after another, every king of Israel and Judah fails. And it gets worse and worse and worse over time until God finally has to take them, curse them, drive them out of the land because of their rebellion. So what does it tell us? Well, the point of the author is in order to have a perfect kingdom, you have to start with a perfect king. None of those guys did it. None of them have fully obeyed God. And so the kingdom failed. So how on earth can we have a perfect kingdom? No. That's how the Old Testament ends. Looking forward, maybe the next one. The New Testament starts how? It introduces us to a descendant of David. A descendant of David who doesn't sin, who fully obeys everything God has him do. Finally, we've got a perfect king. There are more things needed, unfortunately, for this perfect kingdom. All right, you start with a perfect king, but you've still got this fallen, broken, rebellious humanity. And a holy God dwelling in a broken humanity, we know what's going to happen. Judgment is going to happen. But on this man, Jesus, all the judgment for all of our rebellion is placed. Right. So then, let's continue reading the psalm and go back. Right. David has made a vow to God, bring up this temple. God turns around and he makes a vow back. Why? Why did David make this promise? The psalmist says, "For Yahweh has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling, saying, 'This is my resting place forever and ever. Here I will sit enthroned, for I have desired it. I will bless her with abundant provisions. Her poor I will satisfy with food. I will clothe her priests with salvation, and her faithful people will ever sing for joy.'" He made this promise to David because it was his decision. He chose this place. Not because of what David had done, but because he had chosen it. Right? And he continues and says, "Here I will make a horn grow for David and set up a lamp for my anointed one. I will clothe his enemies with shame, but his head will be crowned a radiant crown." So a promise of the coming king. Messianic symbols, horn meaning strength. A lamp, the oil, meaning God's provision. God's going to set up this king and raise him up. And he does so in Jesus. So why is it then Israel is still surrounded by a bunch of enemy nations? You hear about it in the news every day. Israel rebelled against its own king. Right? They crucified him. So, no kingdom. Right? Well, this very David predicted this back in Psalm 110. He says at the beginning in Psalm 10, "Yahweh says to my Lord, 'Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet.'" So while God is currently seated at the right hand of the Father, it's for a time, awaiting God to deal with all the enemies of the world. So what do we deal with the temple piece of this? Jesus didn't build an edifice, did he? Maybe he's gonna? No. You and I are that temple. Right? Paul says, "Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst?" On the day of Pentecost, God moved into Jesus' disciples, just like he had moved into the temple, just like he had moved into the tabernacle. He moved into us. The Spirit of God is now dwelling in us. How is that possible for rebellious, wicked, sinful people like us? Right? Because that judgment has already been placed on Christ. So here we have God dwelling forever in the midst of the people. We're only looking forward to the kingdom. Right? And that kingdom is promised soon. So, because Israel rebelled, the kingdom was open to everybody. You and I today, all we have to do is give our allegiance to this king, and we are included in his kingdom. And one day, we're looking forward to celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles together. Right? So no longer ever looking back at the judgment and the rebellion and the wilderness and our failures that are constantly being placed before us, but looking forward towards Christ. At the end of the festival that we celebrated at the time of Jesus, the priest would walk down the steps, blowing the shofar horn like they were leaving the city. And they said to the people, our ancestors rebelled against God. They turned their eyes towards the gods of the east, the sun, the moon, everybody else. But as for us, our eyes are on the Lord. Right? They ended up going into captivity in Babylon because of their failures. We don't have that. As for us, our eyes are on the Lord.